Europe, basically from around 1750 onward, started to colonize Asia. And India, for example, by the end of the 18th century was substantially in British hands and fell completely to British hands in 1857. And when it came to China, China was the most powerful empire in the world, the most populous country in the world, and it hadn't really been bothered by the outside, and it hadn't bothered the outside for many centuries, in fact. So when the British arrived in what's called the Macartney mission to China in 1795 and met Qianlong, the emperor of the Qing dynasty, the emperor said, "We don't want to trade with you. You have nothing we want," and sent the mission away. And the British came back 44 years later, this time with gunboats in the Pearl River Delta. And that was the first Opium War, telling the Chinese, you're going to buy our opium whether you want it or not. And in fact, the Chinese did not want the opium. I'm thinking, as Donald Trump talks about narco-trafficking, he wouldn't like actually narcotics traffickers saying you have to open up your borders to our trade. But that's what the British did to the Chinese in 1839. And what ensued was the first Opium War from 1839 to 1842. And then the next decade, the Second Opium War, joined by the French, this time burning down the Summer Palace. If you know the Summer Palace in Beijing, it's one of the most beautiful places and historic places. It should not be burned down. But this was European empires showing their dominance of Asia. And then China went into civil war, perhaps the most devastating civil war in history, the Taiping Rebellion, it's called, but it was really essentially a civil war. But the point is that by 1900, Europe completely dominated the world. And that was the world that was expected to last forever. 11 years ago, VUC held a very wonderful conference here on the 100th anniversary of World War I. That's notable because that was the beginning of the end of the European-led world. Because as of 1900, there was almost no way for Asian or for African or for Latin American countries to have a chance in this world. Britain basically controlled almost everything, and the parts that Britain didn't control were controlled by France or controlled by a few other powers. The United States was still not even barely present because it had spent the 19th century not on international empires, but on creating a continental scale empire in North America because it had to defeat all of the native population still. So 1900, Europe dominated. 1914, for reasons that are so tragic, absurd, stupid, without any justification that you could think of in a deep way, Europe went into a cataclysmic civil war. Started nearby here in Sarajevo, of course, for absolutely no reason, I would say. No deep reason, no justification, no fundamental conflicts, no struggle for survival. It was a booming period in history. But Europe thought it would be a glorious one-month war, and it turned out to be a 4-year bloodbath, followed by a Great Depression, followed by another bloodbath. I mentioned all of this basic history because Europe defeated itself so that by 1950, this European-led world would undergo a fundamental change. And that was the rise of the non-Western world, suddenly permissible, allowed because European empires had destroyed each other in the process. So the People's Republic of China finally escaped from a century of outside depredation. First the British, the French, the British, the French, the Americans, then the Japanese, then the Japanese, then the Japanese, and then finally peace and the People's Republic of China established in 1949. And India gained its independence in 1947. And Indochina would have gained its independence around the same time in the early 1950s, but when the French decided to leave, the United States decided to come in and try to maintain imperial rule, but U.S. imperial rule. And of course that led to 15 years of bloodshed in the Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos war. So Vuk, from my point of view, what happened basically in history is Europe came to dominate the world. Europe destroyed its own dominance in a 50-year period from in a 30-year period from 1914 to 1945 in two bloodbaths that were European bloody-mindedness. The U.S. took over the British Empire in 1945, almost like handing the baton in a relay race. The Soviet Union, mainly Russia, it was a dominant empire for Eurasia already, but it became one of the two world's superpowers in 1945 and onward. And what began in 1950, but it wasn't really understood, was the opening for the rest of the world to find its place in a world that had been controlled by Europe. And the control is interesting. What did the European empires do? They did three things. They extracted anything they could of value, so minerals and agriculture products and everything else. Second, they prevented the local populations from getting a decent education or having even the basic infrastructure. And they prevented industrialization from taking place because that was for the European empires. There was only one exception to that in Asia, and that was Japan, for a lot of very interesting reasons. But other than that, basically Europe stopped the progress outside, and the end of the European empires allowed a natural process because there's smart people everywhere, there are entrepreneurs everywhere, there's business energy everywhere, there's experience everywhere. But it was bottled up by European dominance. That was ended. The U.S. wasn't exactly the same kind of empire. I'm sure we'll talk about that.
We're going to talk about that.
But just to say, we arrived in the year 2000 in really a new world. And what is this new world? The new world is that China did such a good job that it had become already, I would say, 25 years ago, a superpower. And now it is a peer of the United States in technology and in its military might and in every other way. And that's something different. Russia, the same way. Russia was regarded by the United States first as an enemy during the Cold War, and then as a has-been after 1991. And that was also delusional by the U.S. and Europe, that Russia, we don't have to care, we can do whatever we want, we can expand NATO, we can try to topple regimes around Russia, we can surround Russia, we can defeat Russia, we can bring down Russia. So that was another delusion. So now we have a multipolar world. That's the fundamental point. And just to finish, because I want to say why I partly disagree with the title, I don't think it's really the Asian century. I think it's the world century now. Because I think that, yes, Asia in the sense, China, a major power, absolutely wonderful in my view. India will be a major power in the 21st century and a very important and positive one. But when we come back and do this event in 2050, Vuk, which we will,
yeah,
promise me, we'll say, look what Africa did during that 25-year period. And you'll say, and Jeff, you said so.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure we're gonna get to that. But I wanna pick on this particular historical parallel. You said you talked about the European empires, reaching out, and America in a way like an offspring, like an offshoot of the European empire, is dealing with certain parts of the world in a way that you just described. How do you contrast it with China's historical characteristics and presence? China has been around for arguably longer than any of the Western empires. And what is the contrast of a historical experience of China in comparison to the conquerors of the West, and what it tells us about the future? Because you read the press, you are watching the news, and there's a lot of talk that you should be scared of the rise of China, that China is somehow dangerous, that it is rising so hard that we should all be worried about the rise of China. Should we be worried about the rise of China, and what history is telling us in this regard?
Yeah, first, the answer is no, we should not be worried. We should be pleased because this is good news for everybody. The world is better off when there's prosperity in as much of the world as possible. We are not in a zero-sum struggle in the world. This is the most important point about economics. Unlike some primitive thinking that has lasted throughout actually centuries and became very popular in the 19th and 20th century, the idea that life is inevitably a struggle and it's either them or us is not true in
But that's
economics.
very Western philosophy, right?
Yes, and it also there's a biological analogy, and it was even named after that. Darwin said we have a struggle of natural selection, and he got the idea of how that worked from a British economist named Thomas Robert Malthus, who wrote in 1798 that there will always be more people than the earth can sustain, and so life will always be near subsistence level, and there will always be some kind of struggle. And when Darwin read that, he said, aha, that's how natural selection works. And he credits Malthus in The Origin of Species with that insight. Then some very bad economists and social thinkers took scientific Darwinism and said that applies to society. Society is a struggle for survival. And so by the end of the 19th century, there were two variants of that idea in Europe, very widespread. One was the national struggle for survival, and the other was the race struggle for survival. And Hitler combined the two. Nazism was a theory of a national race struggle for survival. And Hitler's theory specifically was we need living room. So we have to defeat the Slavs so that we have living room, Lebensraum. And that was a Darwinian, Malthusian, terrible economics, because we are not struggling for survival in economics. Economic well-being comes from technology and skills. It's not limited by our physical resources if we're clever on how we use them. Of course, we can be stupid how we use them. But if we're clever, it's not that either the Chinese get it or we get it. This is ridiculous. It takes someone as primitive as the President of the United States to think that way. So, excuse me, I can say that. You shouldn't say that. But in any event, the point is we are not in a zero-sum struggle. So I'm not at all afraid of China. I rather like the food, the culture, the sightseeing, the people, the friends, the students, the colleagues, the ideas, the good governance, The BYD vehicles, I like it all. Why should I be worried about it? That's not a threat. Any of it is not a threat. I can't see what the threat could possibly be. And then I see these lists. Who's number one? Who's number two? And I said, your competitor journal, every article is to reassure Americans we're number one. China's about to collapse. No, it isn't. Not even remotely about to collapse. But the idea that there's a ranking of countries, it doesn't even make sense to think about it in those terms. Now, having said all of that, China's doing extremely well because actually the Chinese governance system has turned out to be extremely effective. The planning system, which I learned as a student, don't do. So believe me, we don't have any planning in the United States. It's just what the president tweets every 15 minutes is our plan right now. But China is in a meticulous process right now. It's been going on for well over a year at a detail level to complete the 15th plan. And the 15th plan, which I've read a number of drafts, has a very detailed discussion of particular sectors, industries, technologies that China will now work on over the next 10 years, because even though it's a 5-year plan, it's a 10-year horizon, that it will work on to develop. And that's why China actually is the world leader in so many of the current technologies that we have, because China's been working on it from a long-term point of view. So that's been a very, very successful